Good evening and welcome to Malcolm Show. Tonight I'm going to be focusing more on narrative as part of the linguistic principles that I'm proposing are part of the consumer conditioning effect as a consequence of marketing. So, at its fundamental basis, marketing as a term is synonymous with consumer conditioning. And if we start looking at consumer conditioning as the development of behavioral conditioning in a specific modality with the intention of monetizing consumer behavior as well as optimizing conversion funnel rubrics, we can then start differentiating key factors from insignificant factors. So a great way to do this is with a mathematical sieve. This helps us separate signals from noise, and as we separate signals from noise, we find out with a greater salience what points are worth elucidating with future marketing materials. So let's take, for instance, the idea of an advertising campaign of brand A that wants to focus on targeting a demographic that historically wasn't receptive to its marketing materials. Now, with the mathematical sieve, what we can do is leverage the language that is being operationalized, such as specific words, the morphemes of those words in not just the auditory sense as well as the visual sense. We can look at those in the kerning of the typography as well as, the placement of the advert as well as other factors of brand resonance relative to brand recognition. So if we understand that a mathematical sieve is a format for developing a brand narrative, then we can understand a brand narrative as well as the brand identity are cogently connected. So a cogent connection between a brand narrative and brand identity can be summarized reasonably smoothly with the coalescence of a conversion funnel being a synonymous term for a mathematical sieve. So with the intention of a conversion funnel transmuting consumers into customers, a mathematical sieve via the same principle converts noise into signals. It filters the data. So via the data filtration system of a mathematical sieve, a narrative can be formed, not just in the sense of a brand narrative relative to the history and formation of a company developing into the present day story that is at the heart of the brand narrative. It is also a very useful term in political, social and other applications of a narrative as a linguistic principle. So thinking beyond the narrow scope of marketing, if we start developing the idea that a mathematical sieve is a tool without specific allegiance, to put a very poetic spin on it, we can start thinking how the configuration of a mathematical sieve not only identifies consumers from the market generally, it can then, at a more diminutive level, specify, how to phrase this, customers from the consumer base, and then from a more diminutive iteration again, can further specify customers with high purchase frequency versus long-term loyalty and where those two intersect. So if we consider a mathematical sieve an operational vessel for ratios, because whilst a mathematical sieve technically functions most competently with integers, as with, I'm sure most of us do when it comes to mathematics, whole numbers are far simpler than the infinitesimally continuous irrational numbers such as e or pi or square root of 2, for instance. With complete numbers, real numbers, whole numbers, such as 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, for instance, those being prime numbers, we can then look at the data we've gathered as a filtration system that prioritizes prime numbers as a modality for differentiating consumers from customers. Okay, so the idea is that we assign the numeric value as a progressional schema from which the consumer can identify with as part of their identity, as part of the narrative identity, as the brand's marketing strategy, not the brand narrative, important to differentiate those, the brand's marketing strategy, or we could say the organization's marketing strategy, because, say for instance, a large soft drink brand might have many subsidiary companies, in the same sense that a school group might have many colleges, right? So, in that same idea that there might be an overarching brand, that brand narrative has to be differentiated from the brand marketing strategy. Because when it's differentiated from the brand marketing strategy, it provides a cohesive, best way to phrase this, the cohesiveness of the brand identity merges with the brand narrative to form a more traditionally interpretable definition of the term narrative. So we can start thinking of a brand's narrative identity as a continuation of the psychological properties inherent in interpreting data. So, for anybody that's less familiar with the scientific literature, essentially that means the more exposure a person has to a specific narrative, the greater integration they have with that narrative as part of their identity, as well as an understanding from an intrinsic and intrinsic identification. Now, those specific terms are more my personal interpretation of the data, so it's key to make sure that we don't misappropriate extrinsic and intrinsic identification as concrete psychological terminology. However, it does provide us with a really strong basis upon which we can start differentiating what narrative and identity are. So because narrative and identity are very similar when you look at them from not just the psychological perspective but the neurological perspective and a sociological perspective, it becomes easier for us as marketers or the political campaigners in the room, or for instance a military strategist, or anybody who works with what Cialdini refers to as choice architecture, because the choice architecture empowers, because choice architects are empowered by mathematical tools as a systematization of the processes that they use on a day-to-day basis as they become increasingly protocol defined rather than loosely defined. Okay, so as we have stricter and stricter definitions of these terms, the linguistic granularity of terms then starts taking on a more cogent economic expression. So because the language at hand becomes increasingly granular, that it can then become taxonomically categorized. So for instance, in an economic frame, we can perceive certain words such as mathematics or arithmetic or algebra or calculus, geometry, as well as then connecting that with physics and thinking about classic mechanics and quantum mechanics, and then more specifically to fluid dynamics and thermodynamics. And the word dynamic there resonating quite frequently with me personally, apparently. Entirely possible because of the rhyming structure it shares with mathematics and physics, which may seem like a small deviation, but is actually a very key point to elucidate, because it's the aesthetic quality of language cannot be underestimated. As marketers, I'm sure you're all very aware that certain words trigger better responses than others, and with a sufficiently sophisticated linguistic database, aka a vocabulary, it becomes easier and easier for us as marketers, and I'm sure our other choice architects in the audience, to start recognizing that when we sensibly integrate data architecture as a consequence of choice architecture. Now, data architecture as a term, I'm specifying to be a very holistic term defining marketing materials in the context of a digital interface. So, for instance, a digital interface is going to have a far more systematized, how do I say this, collection of techniques and tools available to the professional at hand. So if the professional is then competently aware of what tools are available to them and how they can best familiarize themselves with various marketing techniques, then it becomes increasingly possible for marketing techniques to be pardon me, integrated with the strategy at hand. Now, to avoid stating redundancy, the marketing techniques that are most often used can be described as, from an advertising perspective, might be informative advertising, persuasive advertising, and reminder advertising, which can then be, if we reference Thaler and Sunstein's nudge theory as a form of choice architecture in the making, then the ratio that consequentially arise from that we could filter into our sieve. So if we have informative, persuasive and reminder advertising, then we can figure out the ratio of efficacy best suited to each target audience. So RN ads, pardon me audience, I'm writing notes because this is a study focused podcast. Ads informative persuasive reminder. Now, as any seasoned marketer can tell you, most successful advertising is a combination of these three elements: information, persuasion, and reminding. So, while certain adverts might be more specifically focused on informing the customer about, pardon me, a new feature, or for instance with Jaguar's recent brand rebranding, pardon me, with Jaguar's recent rebranding being a really optimal example of how informative advertising can be a combination of persuasive and informative and persuasive, we can then see how a company such as Jaguar is able to competently integrate their new brand image with their existing customer base. So for instance, because Jaguar have focused on rebranding themselves to be an electric car company, they have to a degree alienated some of their former customer base. At the same time, they are likely to attract new customers because of that rebranding. So this is where narrative becomes really, really interesting, because narrative as an element of branding is huge in this example. It really is first and foremost the idea of how Jaguar have altered their historical brand narrative to be more up to date with market trends, and as a from the neuroscientific perspective of this, if we think about consumer neuroscience, neuroeconomics and neuromarketing to take a more academic tone than the, how should I say, commercial tone, the academic perspective of this is it elucidates such a change in the perspective that it could disrupt the interpretation of Jaguar sufficiently to combine novelty with information. So because the novelty at hand is key in triggering encoding, If you find something that rephrases an idea in a novel way, it can be very easy to identify the most, what's the word, effective form of marketing. So I feel I've made most of my point quite well. I know that there's definite areas I can improve on here. So, with that argument to hand, let's then consolidate the idea from narrative as a marketing component to marketing as a political component. Sorry, narrative as a political and social component, because of the fluidity with which linguistic principles such as grammar, predication, subject can all be integrated into a narrative as part of a greater rhetoric. And whilst in the modern day oratory has become something of a lost art simply because of the sheer volume of available information, it's perhaps more important nowadays to consider the quality of the information we receive. So the perspective I'm looking to share here is that because the tools of narrative have become so much more sophisticated than they were, it becomes increasingly possible for any sort of choice architect, whether that be an individual or an organization, to broadcast information best suited to personal interests rather than societal interests. Now, since the inception of marketing, as well as I'm sure political campaigning and military strategy, the idea of self-gratification, oh, that's a terrible term, fulfilling independently identified objectives has been at the heart of most organisations. Now, in the modern age, corporate social responsibility is a far more prominent component, and it is terrific to see it become a far more prominent component of modern marketing. The key aspect to think about here is how narrative can be constructed to influence social dynamics beyond the level of economic prosperity. So, for instance, a very strong example is the Cambridge Analytica scandal, quote unquote, from 2000. No, I'm thinking of a different thing. Circa 2016, as a result of the the UK national referendum over Brexit, and the US presidential election, which ended up having results that were deemed to be the results of, well, interference, I believe is the simple word. So, what we can conclude from that is that whilst the information provided to those companies was freely available via the digital platforms, unique point of unique selling point is, well, companies such as Alphabet and Meta have these huge libraries of consumer data which is specifically there to optimize marketing, whether that be for monetary incentives, financial incentives, social incentives, or even, perhaps psychological operations. It's worth noting that these technologies do have military applications, and to ignore that would be somewhat naive. So remaining within the cohesiveness of the original narrative with mathematical sieves and the economy of linguistics, the idea that I really want to focus upon is how... Oh, hello, 09. I'm well, thank you. How are you? So, I will respond somewhat periodically as I'm studying out loud. So the idea that I had in my head was combinatorial ratios is the application of ratios combinatorially via algorithms to help elucidate the idea of how a mathematical sieve can be used as a linguistic filter with specific granularities for message permeability. I could use a shorthand, or I could say what I mean. Mathematical sieves as linguistic filters. Organizing input taxonomically to optimize output with the incentive of user engagement. Okay, so I doubt if interesting smart for the channel. If you're offering it free of charge, you're more than welcome, but this is more of a studying tool. If it becomes, a bigger deal than that, maybe we can speak in the future, but right now it's just for the sake of me. It's, if there's viewers and listeners and whatnot, that's cool. It's just, I'm studying undergraduate and I want to essentially have different, I want to have multimodal encoding. I don't have any social media stuff. My email is malcolm-jack@live.co.uk. So just email us on that. Alright? Cool. As we were saying, so here we are. The idea at hand. So okay, so if during the game we speak mathematically, let's review ourselves now. No, but thank you for the offer. It's kind of you. So, as I was saying, if the mathematical sieves can serve as a linguistic filter, then effectively all communication can be viewed from the perspective of game theory. So if we take the idea of finite and infinite games from von Neumann and Morgenstern's 1949 publication of Theory on Games and Economic Behaviour, pardon me, we can interpret the idea of mathematical sieves as a facilitation to the continuation of the infinite game. So instead of, because a marketer needs a market, right? So if the continuous idea of optimization for the sake of the consumer, whether it be in pure economic terms or as a corporate social responsibility endeavour or as a political manoeuvre as part of a digital platform's marketing services, the idea at hand is the idea at hand is essentially language will become numerically valued so that every word, I mean, if it isn't already, will be numerically valued so that no matter what you're choosing to say, you will be expressing an idea that has a value, a value. So because the numeric values will then become increasingly salient the longer you spend in the system, in the same way that you'll find when you spend time with different cultures, different words have different resonance. So for instance, we might tailor accessible products with, such as if you're advertising for a large supermarket chain, with short words, simple concepts, hearty, wholesome, packs the right kind of punch, not too much, not too little, very inoffensive yet kind of fun, so that customers over a certain age don't feel offended, and yet at the same time they can understand, oh, it's all the nature of being somewhat lively, we get it. At the same time, it's vital to remember that as marketing materials climb up the socioeconomic ladder, that idea of tone as a matter of taste will change. So for example, what's considered tasteful at a lower socioeconomic level is different to what's considered tasteful at a high socioeconomic level. So if we consider marketing for either luxury cars, luxury watches, it might be Rolls Royce, it might be Rolex. If we're marketing to those brands, even at that point, there is a differentiation between having an entry-level Submariner, something like 6-7 grand these days. It's different to having a 4-figure watch than it is to having a 6-figure car, because as is the sort of the motif with the Rolls Royces, you don't buy it to drive it, is you buy it because you want to be driven. Now, comparatively, if you're marketing a Ferrari, it's a different situation, and the marketing materials would reflect that. So the important idea to focus upon is the mathematical sieves at work have to filter language to a socioeconomically relative granularity. Oh, that's beautiful. Socioeconomic granularity of language. And as the marketing materials start reflecting the alteration of language to better fit the target audience, target demographic, the mathematical sieve can be adjusted so that its weightings, such as in with artificial intelligence neural network, in the same way that biological neural network would work in the same way, is you think about different ideas, you then change the way you think about things. You might have a confirmation bias reaffirmed, or you might change your entire worldview. The point stands is, when you link that with the idea of advertising formats from a marketing strategy, whether it be to inform, persuade, or remind a consumer of an idea, if you can remind the consumer sufficiently that the conversion funnel turns that consumer into a customer, and then you've got the pleased and proud owner of a week's worth of Rolls Royces and a month's worth of Rolexes, then it becomes easier and easier to identify the language most resonant with the socioeconomic class. Now, if we consider socioeconomic classes to be, for simplicity's sake, upper, middle, and lower, or you could have Personally, I mean, I think it's simplest just to differentiate into upper and lower. The tricky thing is when you start looking at larger data sets to have a finer granularity of result, it does help to have more categories. I think generally speaking though, by having that binary differentiation at the heart of the principle of the market, the principle of the marketing strategy, you can very quickly differentiate whether something is higher or lower, in the same way that if you can figure out which word is going to make more money, then the semantic rubric in that point is the more valuable word. Now obviously these mathematical sieves can be organized in a myriad of ways for a myriad of purposes. The important thing is recognizing which ideas specifically resonate at which socioeconomic levels. So if we consider these various socioeconomic levels to be upper, middle and lower, then we can also conceivably interpret the data as consumer data, not consumer linguistic data from body language, as also having socioeconomic value. Okay, so to update viewers and listeners on what I've got in front of me, mathematical sieves as linguistic filters organizing input taxonomically to optimize output with the incentive of user engagement, pardon me, and communication and game theory, and socioeconomic granularity of language, and socioeconomic kinesics and their taxonomy. That is an interesting level of reverb in the mic that wasn't there earlier. Not quite sure what's triggered it, so let's power through and continue thinking. That is curious, isn't it? It just sort of came out of nowhere. Right. Sorry, that isn't meant to be overcompensating. I'm trying to speak with a more powerful voice because when I was listening to yesterday's episode, I felt that I was speaking somewhat feebly, and I didn't feel, one, that represented the channel very well, and two, I don't think it's something I want to continue with personally. I feel that if the channel is, even though it's for my own personal usage, and I may not ever have a global-sized audience, despite the opportunity afforded to me by YouTube and the internet, I feel if I behave as such, in the same principle of behaving as if God exists, or as if there's some sort of discernible reward system that would change your afterlife positioning, shall we say. Instead of getting into anything denominationally specific, let's stay on hand with the idea of marketing and mathematical sieves as linguistic filters for determining socioeconomic class structure. So if we can then continue the idea that marketing is in principle consumer conditioning, which is a reductive description of social engineering, then social engineering if we can consider social engineering to be a consequence of marketing, especially with, let's be very honest, planetary scale marketing technologies very readily available to anybody with the budget. So when you have the budget, these technologies are now affording people a very direct pipeline to having the world at their fingertips. Now, of course, there's a market and many different channels competing to achieve the same sort of outcome. However, However,
simply because
the
the tools are
world class
and
and quite
military
frankly
grade,
military grade, and
it doesn't mean
it
that
doesn't
the
mean that
marketing
the
materials
marketing
provided,
materials
such as the
provided,
adverts
such as the
themselves
adverts
or
themselves
the
or
branding
the
choices of
branding choices
each
of each
organization, are
organization,
conducive
are
to a successful
conducive to a
campaign.
successful
You can
campaign.
have
You can
the
have
the
the
best
the
car in the
best
world or the
car
best
in the
horse
world
in
or
the
the best
world.
horse in the
If
world.
the
If
driver or the
the
jockey
driver or the
respectively
jockey
doesn't
respectively
know which
doesn't
way the
know
track's
which way
flowing,
the track's
it's not
flowing,
super
it's
helpful.
not super helpful.
So,
So,
we now need to
we
continue
now need to
elaborating on
continue
how a
elaborating on
linguistic
how a
filtration
linguistic
system
filtration system
becomes, from my
from
perspective,
my perspective,
and the literature does
and the
support this to
literature
many
does support
degrees.
this to
So, for
many
instance,
degrees. So, for instance, there was Campbell, what was his name?
Two syllables began
Two
with a
syllables
K. The
began
study
with a
was on in
K. The study was done in
2014.
2014.
The title of the study
The title of the
included
study
emotional
included
contagion, and
emotional contagion, and
it was
essentially
conducted
it was
via
conducted
Facebook, possibly
via
by
Facebook,
Facebook
possibly by
directly,
Facebook
upon
directly,
700,000
upon
users without
700,000
their
users
awareness,
without their
and the
awareness,
study found that they
and
were
the
able
study
to
found that they were able to remotely
long-term
change
emotions
long-term
without
emotions
the consumer
without the
awareness.
consumer awareness.
So, if the
So,
users
if the
had their
users had their
affective state changed
affective state
remotely
changed
without
remotely without
conscious awareness,
conscious awareness,
and that was in
and that was in
2014,
2014,
which, if let's be,
which,
let's say
if let's
it's
say
mid-year, so
it's
let's arguably say
mid-year,
it
so let's
was
arguably say that
precisely
was
11 years ago to
precisely
the
11
day,
years ago to the day,
then not
then
only
not
will
only will
the application of
the
Moore's law be
application of
very
Moore's
useful
law be
here.
very useful
So
here.
Moore's law, for those
So Moore's law,
unfamiliar,
for those
is
unfamiliar, is
an axiom that
technology
I think
essentially,
computer
I think it's
chips
specific computer
double
chips
in
double in
potential
output
capacity
capacity
every 18 months or
every
so.
18 months or so.
So
So
11 years,
11 years,
132
divided by 18,
the
the
7
something.
So
something. So
effectively that means
there's been about 7 cycles of Moore's law since the inception of the publication of that study,
let's be
which,
very honest,
let's be very honest, if that's a publicized study, it's entirely possible.
Sorry, if that was a study funded by Facebook, then it's
very possible
that
the results
were published with
specific language requests by the company themselves, as well as being published to journals, specifically
cooperative with
Facebook's objectives.
So if we consider 7 cycles further on,
at
apparently
double the rate of before, then
if their success rate was
2%, and we consider that to be 2 to the power of 7, then we've got 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128x potentiality. Now, whilst that mathematics is technically correct, let's not obfuscate the principle via numbers.
The principle of the
matter is that
Facebook were able to
edit emotions over a decade ago. I
very
sincerely doubt they've gotten worse at it.
Especially since
Instagram is now within their repertoire, as well as
Alphabet,
the parent company of Google, having YouTube within their midst doing similar things.
And let's not forget
that TikTok and X, as well as many other social media platforms, are very competently influencing social rhetoric. Okay. So
that summarizes
pretty much everything I needed to say there.
I want to
update this. Insert one column right.
I have a spreadsheet
that dictates my results from these. So
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and 2. Right. Okay, so
I figure
if I can improve my chess skill ever so slightly whilst doing this podcast, that can only cheer me up and theoretically improve my ability to identify an algorithm, because I don't enjoy social media, so I'd much rather have this. Okay. 40 minutes in, we can definitely get another game done. Let's go up a level and speak slightly more informally.
Actually, no, let's do our best to
maintain a reasonable academic time. Okay, so
mathematical sieves,
filtering linguistic granularity with the intention of identifying linguistic granularity relative to socioeconomic status via identification of keywords in each demographic.
Digital
platforms gain the ability to leverage biochemical
reward
systems
as part
of
operational
functionality.
So with the
consistent leveraging of biochemical reward systems in
concordance
with a mathematical sieve focusing on
linguistic
inputs, converting linguistic inputs to numeric outputs. Oh, hang on a minute, Malcolm.
Use SLA
sausage. That was
Let's
right
go
there,
back
wasn't
a few
it?
paces,
Let's go back a few paces, ladies and gentlemen.
And
that's what we should have done. That's what we should have done.
Pardon me. There it is. That's what we should have done.
That's what we should have done.
Okay. Back to the future. Okay, so if we've identified
that mathematical sieves are essentially
the formal
description of
a filtration
system working at
a
scalability
spanning individual consumer conditioning
to
planetary
scale social engineering,
then we accept the premise that digital marketing
technologies
affords Oh, hang on, my phone's ringing. That's not terribly
professional.
Oh, there it is.
There it is.
Oh. Pardon me, audience. Good evening. I am presently recording technically live.
Can I phone you back?
Chats in a bit.
Love you. Bye.
Right. Pardon me, audience. as I was saying,
if we consider mathematical sieves to be a linguistic filter of socioeconomic application via digital marketing platforms, which I've now said at least half a dozen times,
we can then start
instantiating that certain language has greater economic utility than other language. So, if we understand that certain demographics respond better to certain words, and
other demographics respond better to other words,
then we can develop a ratio-based combinatorial system which
can
consistently differentiate
the language
most resonant with each socioeconomic class. So
with each socioeconomic
class having its own
language
system,
then there's an
in-group out-group quality.
So it's an us versus them.
Sort of thing. So as put forward by Sapolsky in his 2017 publication of the book Behave, Human Beings at Our Best and Worst.
The main title is Behave.
The main title is Behave. Is
because
human beings necessarily
have in-groups and out-groups,
because otherwise we'd all love everybody in an endless love-off where every single member of society was so shall we say romantically entwined that the fun never stopped.
Consider it the
idea that
us and them can be an internalized and externalized idea throughout biological and technological neural networks. So that's effectively the weighting system. So if weightings can be analogized neural network weightings plus ratio specified mathematical sieves plus substrates because that's a great word which I'm sure will have some sort of utility. So if we consider the
mathematical sieve user interface porosity Anyway. Effectively, the idea is because a mathematical sieve can consistently differentiate language, then the differential
is
the
economic value. And because the
differential is the economic value,
the differential is a ratio because there's a relationship between how positively something's interpreted from how negatively it's interpreted. So if a mathematical ratio serves as sufficient data to connect it to the consumer conditioning idea. So then Oh yeah. I did see something. Okay. My apologies for the quality of output on that more recent game. I had a fantastic workflow earlier today, starting from 10 a.m. all the way up through 7 p.m. where I was just writing. I think I read for maybe an hour of it. I did have about a half hour lunch break, so that's 9 hours, about 7.5 hours of writing straight. So heads in a great place full of ideas. Very happy to have a consistent train of thought. One. It's better to have those at lower level. There we go. Okay. And oofed. 91's not a prime because it's 7 times 13. 6, 5, 9, 13, 1. Those elusive, brilliant moves are on the way. Okay. And it's only Wednesday. What a wonderful week. Okay, so the ideas I've had in my head is I need to connect how the ratio data streams influence linguistic behavior via social conduits. And technological conduits. Because there's the human and the interface. For anybody else
studying,
if you're not aware of a
PESTLE analysis, which is an acronym for political, environmental, social, technological, legal and economical, those six rubrics are terrific for studying anything and everything, especially the social sciences, but you can find application for them in formal science as well. Don't underestimate business terminology because of its almost ubiquitous utility. If you consider you're studying as a business where the profit margin is
the increase in your grading.
So say for instance, do what I do, which is typed efforts into various AI and receive gradings. Because the AI is going to grade itself consistently. So if you give the same priming prompt of I want you to grade, for instance, as I do, as the strictest senior professor from the following 7 schools in alphabetical order: Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, Oxford, Princeton, Stanford, Yale. So I feel that's a good breadth of mathematical rigor and philosophical variability.
Then I take up the average
from each of the 7 AIs, 7 evaluations, find the average, then put that average into the spreadsheet to have the other average, and then eventually you get the idea of roughly how well you're doing. And then if you do that for 3 months every day where you're submitting
even a few hundred words,
but I'm trying to do at least 1,000 or so,
then
how many words was in today's? 2247.
Now, there is the
header on here, so let's
be honest.
224. So
2,000 words.
2,000 words.
So if I can let's say we average 1,000 words a day over the summer of 5 days a week. That's approximately 12 weeks. Then 5 times 12, 60. That's 60,000 words. If I can have 60,000 words typed over the summer, not including my tendency to go above and beyond, then once term starts, I've essentially typed 6 dissertations worth of material, which I have. Let's be honest. AI might grade differently to human lecturers, teachers, professors. The idea is that still it's a consistent grading system. So if I'm consistently getting better in every evaluation, then at least I know I'm doing something correct and I'm listening to feedback. And if you're writing every day, you're going to at least become more familiar with the material, you're going to become more linguistically technical, you're going to understand better what your strengths and weaknesses are. Because let's not underestimate the AI. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's going to give me incompatible data. Sure, I might. Let's say I was scraping by first this year, which is the UK equivalent of an A star. Then even if I only gain 5 percentage points and get a 75 after the summer, that's like 8%. That's decent. That's not including overturn where I get feedback from the professor. So you want this. Then I edit that. Then I can update the generative AI's memory, and you continue from there. I'm not entirely sure I'm defending this, but I'm trying to explain to people that the idea at hand is there are terrific technologies available for students. Make the most of them. Ratio says 6 languages, social and technological. I like the word granularity. Linear. Interface. Optimization. Open bracket. heavy end ratio, which is impressions to engagement. Signifying improved engagement relative to impressions, aka not just to triggers. Social credit scores. That's the idea needed to remember. Yeah, social credit scores. So if these mathematical sieves can essentially optimize digital platform language as well as marketers being able to leverage these mathematical sieves as linguistic filters, then effectively they can let's say if you're in a country such as China that has a social credit score, then the way you behave online is part of that. And essentially these ranking algorithms function very, very similarly. A ranking algorithm isn't very different in principle from a mathematical sieve. The idea is it's trying to find a specific outcome and differentiate it taxonomically from the input. So if we continue, that's what? Hang on. Why is it really sloppy there, around? Moving swiftly on. If a social credit score is something that we can anticipate being non-unique to China, then we must consider that in principle the idea may already be part of, shall we say, the westernized digital interface constituting generative AI and social media and streaming services, as well as various online communities. So whether that be I'm thinking stuff like World of Warcraft and other MMOs where they've got really large communities. So if these large communities all effectively function within a ranking system, then the hierarchy of that ranking system will influence the physical world. Digital hierarchy. Digital hierarchy influencing physical hierarchy. Which means all user input has value, which means all user input is ranked, which means all user input has a score, and that means we are in competition, which means the most relatively valuable person as per each platform's ranking system will be rewarded as such. Now the question is, how do digital reward systems and the cultural consequences. How digital reward systems select Apex users and the cultural consequences. Not a bad dissertation question. Well, what I want to do is a normal scope, so it's nice to have various iterations of the idea, so that whatever parameters they try to confine me with, I can nuance my way around. I find that ethics tends to be the most useful way to think about all these various ideas, because there's so much diversity in how ethics can be interpreted and applied. Oh, there's a pin. Yes, right. Apparently, mate 11. Oh, that's pretty. Let's be honest and John, that's pretty. Okay, so that was best. That was excellent. That's best. There's best, because what was excellent. That's excellent. Right.
Cool. Right.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening and watching everybody. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel.
Feel free to leave a comment.
I'll do my best to get to them when I can. If you have any requests of areas for me to specify, please make sure
you're as clear as you can be with it.
I do have a tendency to look at things very generally, and whilst I am working on focusing in on the concentrated matter, it is always helpful to have a really specific question. Okay,
thanks for listening, thanks for watching,
have a great rest of the day. Cheers, bye.